You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Folks, Friday, the end of the week, as if it's not all blending together for most of you out there. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio and all the different outlets where you can find this program. And if you're only listening audibly, did you know you can come over and see the video simulcast and join the live chat room with the other Intrep heads during this very show and every night? That's over on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, see all the goodness that is my channel. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, or even if you are and you haven't looked around a bit, if you go down below this, well, not below this video, but click back out to my main page, you're going to see there's over 200 videos there. From all the videos of this show that are stored in archive there that you can watch at any time. You can't join the chat rooms in those. You can only watch the replay of the chat room, but you can comment on the videos. And there's also a bunch of other stuff, some of my Egyptian travels, family stuff, other commentary. I've done books of mine that I've read in entirety from chapter to chapter in various episodes. So you can go down there and see them. One of my favorites is the series I did on David, King David of Israel. If you want to find out a little more history, a little more about what apologetics is all about, in a biblical sense especially, and also, I guess you would say in an ancient historical sense, come on over and listen to that series if you haven't yet already. So welcome to my channel, and subscribe please, and hit the little bell so you can get notifications. And also I want to say, I want to bring this up again, and I probably will from time to time over here. There's the new shirt for the Intrepid radio program, and you can find it right here. Let me put the graphic up. There's one of them right there. Just shows the Buck Rogers style rocket I created for this, for everything that I was doing Intrepid 10, 11 years ago. And you can find that there, and it's a revamped for the Intrepid radio program. You can also see here it is in black as well. And there's also a hoodie. Let me find that right there. There's the hoodie version of this, for those of you who like that. And let me throw up one more. This is, my Son of a Patriot shirt. That's not showing it on a shirt there. That's my Etsy channel, by the way. Etsy.com, etsy.com/shop/Son of a Patriot. That's all my stuff there. And you can also see, by the way, there is Daughter of a Patriot. I started her as a redhead, and then she, of course, went over into the brunette for my wife. And that's basically modeled after my wife. So you can wear your Son of a Patriot or Daughter of a Patriot shirt. And there's one more I was going to show you. This is a shirt Rainey asked me to design, her UFO shirt. And we designed this, I think, early last week. Hop in, loser. We're doing butt stuff. And she absolutely, that drives her giddy. And she loves this shirt. So there you go. There's some of the different offerings that we have over on my Etsy page. But be sure to get your Intrepid radio shirt, and it's right here. And folks, if you're just listening, just go to my Etsy page, etsy.com/shop/Son of a Patriot. and you'll see this shirt, the Intrepid Radio shirt, plus all the other offerings of shirts that I've done for some of the different series of shows that we've done, and different patriotic topics and stuff like that. So, welcome to the show tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking your Friday night. Now, maybe you'd be out clubbing or you'd be out doing other things on a Friday night. And since you're sequestered at home, a bit isolated, I want to thank you for taking your time to come over here and spend it with me and the other Intrepids on this show. Now, tonight, I want to get back into the flood mythologies. But before I do, I want to ask you, when you're sequestered now, are you taking the time to do some things that build yourself up? Time for yourself. Are you taking time to meditate? Are you taking time to read? Are you taking time to do those things? Sometimes, when we have extra time on our hands, we certainly have ways of finding ways to fill in all the gaps, and then we find out, I don't have as much time as I thought I had. But if you've got time to read, I'm going to make a suggestion here. I'm reading this book right now by Joseph Ellis. It's called Founding Brothers. And if you see this, now this is more, I know I've got listeners all around the globe, and a lot of you in Great Britain, a lot of you in Australia, some in New Zealand, and other places, Europe and so on, and Africa. But this is a book, especially if you're an American, and you live here, and you live under our system of government, this is actually a pretty good book to read. It's called Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation. And it's by, as I mentioned, Joseph J. Ellis. He's author of American Sphinx. I believe this book, I don't know if this book, this book won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, Ellis is very passionate about history, but at the same time, he remains remarkably readable about history. And I wanted to familiarize you with, I thought this book was a great book. We talk about the Founding Fathers, and then it became the Founders, because fathers, some people deemed that to be too sexist. But remember, in an 18th century framework and context, they weren't so much into the making sure every gender was covered, especially just the main two, male and female. So the Founding Fathers became the Founders, and this guy is writing a book on the Founding Brothers, all those revolutionary thinkers who were there establishing things. And there's a couple of passages before we start getting into the flood that I want to read you out of this book. And if you are not an American citizen, you're going to still find this history fantastic. And there is a couple of things that I read here. Listen to some of this. This is just a little section out of the book, and it's taken a little out of context here. But he's talking about the founding of the nation, of course, and the people behind it. And he's saying, despite the confident and providential statements of leaders like Paine, Jefferson, Adams, the conclusions that looked so foregone to us had yet to congeal for them. Remember, this was all new to them. They were creating something that hadn't existed before in the form of government. And the old adage applies, men make history, and the leading members of the revolutionary generation realized they were doing so. But they can never know the history they are making. We can look back and make the era of the American Revolution a center point, then scan the terrain upstream and downstream, but they can only know what's downstream. An anecdote that Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician and signer of the Declaration of Independence, liked to tell in his old age makes the point memorably. On July 4th, 1776, that's the day we signed the Declaration of Independence, just after the Continental Congress had finished making its revisions of the Declaration and sent it off to the printer for publication, Rush overheard a conversation between Benjamin Harrison of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. And this is a quote. "I shall have a great advantage over you, Mr. Gerry," said Mr. Harrison. when we are all hung for what we're now doing. From the size and weight of my body, I shall die in a few minutes, but from the lightness of your body, you will dance in the air an hour or two before you're dead. Rush recalled that the comment procured a transient smile, but it was soon succeeded by the solemnity with which the whole business was conducted. And so you think of these founding fathers, and I know that there are lots have been written about the lives of the founding fathers after they signed this declaration, the signers of the declaration. And it's an interesting study all by itself. But there's something else I read just this morning, and I wanted to share this with you. Let me see where this starts here. I should have marked it better, so I could give this to you. Listen to how this is written, and consider, if you're a United States citizen, if you're an American, listen to it intently. If you are not an American citizen, listen to this and see how this country was founded. I know in conversations I've had with some of you that there are sometimes European or other views that are very different of what we hold dear in this country. And this might clear some of that up for some of you. Let's see. I want to see where to start this. Let's see. It's a couple of pages, and I want to read to you. And it says like this. All right. Now, he's talking about the founding of the country, the documents that were written by these people. These were all new things that they were creating. And so I'm going to jump in to the conversation here. He says, this is pretty much how matters stood in 1789, when the newly elected members of the federal government gathered in New York City and proceeded to test the proposition, as Abraham Lincoln so famously put it in his Gettysburg Address, whether any nation so conceived or so dedicated can long endure. We've already noted some of the assets and liabilities they brought along with them. On the assets side of the historical ledger, the full list would include the following: a bountiful continent and ocean away from European interference, a youthful population, nearly 4 million, about half of which was 16 years of age or younger, and therefore certain to grow exponentially over subsequent decades, a broad dispersion of property ownership among the white populace, based on easy access to available land, a clear commitment to republican political institutions, rooted in the prowess and practice of the colonial assemblies, then sanctified as the only paradigm during the successful war for independence, and then institutionalized in the state constitutions, and last but far from least, a nearly unanimous consensus that the first chief executive would be George Washington. Only one man, to be sure, but an incalculable asset. By the way, when I use the word Republican, they're talking about members of a republic, not the Republican Party, which didn't exist at the founding. So, on the liability side of the ledger, 4 items topped the list. First, no one had ever established a republican government on the scale of the United States. And the overwhelming judgment of most respected authorities was that it could not be done. Second, the dominant intellectual legacy of the Revolution, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, stigmatized all concentrated political power, and even its most virulent forms depicted any energetic expression of governmental authority as an alien force that all responsible citizens ought to repudiate and, if possible, overthrow. Third, apart from support for the Continental Army during the war, which was itself the support, I'm sorry, I lost my spot here. I'm holding my book funny. My eyes shift to the first line, the line above, rather than the next line. Let me start that sentence over, or at least part of it. He's got a long sentence here. The overwhelming judgment of most respected authorities was that it would not be done. Could not be done, this nation, this republic. And second, the dominant intellectual legacy of the revolution, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, stigmatized all concentrated political power, and even its most virulent forms depicted any energetic expression of governmental authority as an alien force that all responsible citizens ought to repudiate and, if possible, overthrow. Third, apart from the support for the Continental Army during the war, which was itself sporadic, uneven, and barely adequate to assure victory, the states and regions comprising the new nation had no common history as a nation and no common experience behaving as a coherent collective. For example, while drafting the Declaration in Philadelphia in June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson had written back to friends in Virginia that it was truly disconcerting to find himself deployed at that propitious moment nearly 300 miles from, quote, my country, end quote, his home. Fourth, and finally, according to the first census, commissioned by the Congress in 1790, nearly 700,000 inhabitants of the fledgling American Republic were black slaves. The vast majority, over 90%, concentrated in the Chesapeake region and points south, their numbers also growing exponentially in a kind of demographic defiance of all the Republican rhetoric uttered since the heady days of 1776. If permitted to define a decade, now here's something very interesting. If permitted to define a decade somewhat loosely, then the next decade for them was the most crucial and consequential in American history. Other leading contestants for that title, the years 1855 to 65, we're talking Civil War here in America, and the 1940s, World War II, come to mind, and can make powerful claims to be sure. But the first decade of our American history as a sovereign nation will always have primacy because it was the first. It set the precedents, established in palpable fact what the Constitution had only outlined in purposely ambiguous theory, thereby opening up and closing off all options for the history that followed. The Civil War, for example, was a direct consequence of the decision to evade and delay the slavery questions during the most vulnerable early years of the Republic. Similarly, America's emergence as the dominant world power in the 1940s could never have occurred if the United States had not established stable national institutions at the start that permitted the consolidation of the continent. From the Native American perspective, of course, this consolidation was a conquest. The apparently irresistible urge to capitalize and mythologize as founding fathers the most prominent members of the political leadership during this formative phase has some historical as well as psychological foundations, for in a very real sense we are politically, if not genetically, still living their legacy. And the same principle also applies or explains the parallel urge to demonize them, since any discussion of their achievement is also an implicit conversation about the distinctive character of American imperialism, both foreign and domestic. Now, I thought that was a very interesting section that describes the American culture as it was established, in its very beginnings, the struggles that they had as they were doing this. And if you are craving something to read, I would once again suggest picking up Founding Brothers by Ellis. It's a very intriguing book about our nation. And if you're not an American citizen and you enjoy history, it's a great history book. Now, before we move on to what we're going to be talking about tonight with the flood and so on, I want to read for you, since and I've done this before, but I think it's important for we citizens to remind ourselves of this, and that is the Declaration of Independence itself. Now, if you are not an American citizen, and you are interested in American history and what it is guys like me believe about this, here is the Declaration of Independence. We celebrate this every 4th of July, and even here in America it gets forgotten. And the real meaning behind the celebration, the holiday, the fireworks, and all of that. But this is what they voted in on the 4th of July in 1776. And this is the verbiage of the Declaration of Independence. Now, don't get lost in this. Don't go talking about other things. If you're a citizen of this country, listen to this. Remind yourself of what it is we founded in 1776. And it goes like this. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I'm just going to make a note here that when they penned these things, the Founding Fathers struggled with the issue of slavery for many years to follow, and regretted that they did not include this issue, address this issue in a more distinct way. Now, they addressed it by saying all men are created equal, meaning all mankind. Every human is what they're referring to. And this did become a fly in the ointment all the way up until the Civil War. But there were many of these founders who owned slaves. And when they were penning these words, it's almost like they could feel the lightning bolt coming down from the sky to zap them where they sat, because they knew they needed to address this issue. Now, keep in mind, folks, this is also a period of time in context. You have to think of how humanity viewed slavery at this time in our existence. And it was something where these founding fathers and the people who followed set that new paradigm based on this document. And, of course, other things that we founded, the Constitution and so on. That is what drew us eventually out of slavery and the practice of owning slaves. So let me repeat this. He says, the document says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men / humans are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. By the way, in current speak where people are, we got to overthrow this government, we need something, they don't know what you have to establish new guards for the security of the people and the nation. And so such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. And to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then they go through and they enlist all the reasons that they believe that the monarchy needs to be stepped away from in the colonies. We need to establish our own nation. So, and it goes on to finish after they list all of their what would you call it? Their complaints, if you will. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances, our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the titles of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of a right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And then you have all the signers of the Constitution, or the Declaration below. So you know what they were doing, these founders? They were establishing the fact that they were independent of the crown, that they were willing to go to war against the greatest war machine of the day. And they did it. So we're at the end of the time. I've actually run over time. And so take that all to heart. We're going to come back after the break and jump into the Ark story again, the Great Deluge. Sit tight. We'll be right back. All right, gang, thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can also catch the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel, and that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the chat room there and the other Intrep heads and have a good time discussing this program and other things while over there tonight. And now let's get into the Great Deluge again, the Great Flood story. As earlier in the week, we have talked about Atlantis. We've talked about the disappearance of a continent. We've talked about Plato's descriptions of Atlantis and how there was a landmass that simply disappeared around 9,000 years ago. 8,000, 7,000. It's that span of time between 9,000 and 7,000 BCE that all these major geographical changes were taking place. And this is where I think you can plug Atlantis in. But there is this all hails back to the Great Flood. And we talk about, we all have a biblical context, which would be a Judeo-Christian context for the flood. That is the most predominant, it seems, in the world today, at least in Western culture, is a remembrance of a great flood and Noah and the animals on the ark 2 by 2 and so on. And we talked about that a bit yesterday. But there are other accounts which we mentioned yesterday. I'm just going to hit on these lightly and talk about this a little bit. And for a Friday show, I think we could probably end up wrapping up this whole idea of the flood, of Atlantis, and so on. We're going to talk less about Atlantis, more about the flood. Did you know that there are several accounts? As I mentioned already earlier this week, there are over 600 different cultural tales of a great flood. And those 600 are comprised of different cultures, different tribal stories, all different kinds of stories around the globe. It is an event that was so catastrophic that it has remained in the human consciousness, perhaps genetic memory. It's in who we are because humanity experienced this, and it was so vast and so universal, so worldwide, that it gripped not just the reality for humans, but the mythology of the humans, the imaginations. And all these stories were created, many of them very similar in their contexts. The Great Flood is not only a biblical tale of Noah, but you find the Great Flood mentioned in other cultures, such as the Sumerian cultures. If you look at the Great Flood through the Sumerian cuneiform tablets, you get another view of the flood. The earliest flood legend in the world mythology originates with the Sumerians, not with the Genesis account written by Moses of Noah and the ark, but by the Sumerians 1,500 years earlier than the book of Genesis was penned. And it dates back to about, there are some that talk about it being 200 BCE to 400 BCE, which is long after Genesis was written. But this is when it was written down or copied down, textually copied down. And the text found in Sumerian clay tablets provides impressive stories of the human origins and the creation of mankind and the interference of the gods in a remarkable way. Now, this wasn't originally written. The cuneiform texts were not written in 200 BCE. They were translated in 200 BCE and written down for common folk to be able to read this. Cuneiform tablets date back to a good 2,000 years before that. 1,500 years, maybe at best. And so the text found in the Sumerian clay tablets provides this impressive story of human origins, the creation, interference of the gods, the great deluge, the story of creation according to the Sumerians. It says here, 1,200 years had not yet passed when the land extended and the peoples multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil, he was the chief god of the Anunnaki, the Anu. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me, he said. With their uproar I am deprived of sleep. Cut off supplies for the people. Let there be a scarcity of plant life to satisfy their hunger. Adad, another custodian, should withhold his rain, and below the flood, the regular flooding of the land which made it fertile, should not come up from the abyss. Let the wind blow and parch the ground. Let the clouds thicken but not release a downpour. Let the fields diminish their yields. There must be a rejoicing among them. From the book, and this is from the book of William Bromley, The Gods of Eden, that he brings this interpretation. Now, in the myths, it shows that gods were angry with the noise that humans were making, and they decided to destroy humanity. Now, of course, noise can be interpreted as anything that was against the will of the gods, or defying their power, their supremacy over humanity. As mentioned in Genesis and other mythologies, such as the cataclysm of Ra, which we're also going to look at tonight. Also, you can see a bloodthirsty and ruthless behavior of the gods, another common element among all these myths. In another Assyrian tablet, we see this. It says, and this is a quote from an Assyrian tablet, "Command that there be a plague. Let Namtar diminish their noise. Let disease, sickness, plague, and pestilence blow upon them like a tornado." They commanded, and there was a plague. Namtar diminished their noise. Disease, sickness, plague, and pestilence blew upon them like a tornado. Now, in the Sumerian tablets, it mentions that just before the flood, the gods left the earth to be safe in the heavens, and they returned after the end of the flood. The story of Noah depicts a similar story as that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the Bible. According to that epic, the god Enki, who we've heard of many times in the things that I write about and talk about, or Ea, as he was known in neighboring Akkad, Enki Ea was the creator of man, of whom he was fond because of this. And Enki approached a man named I can never pronounce his first time out, even though I've pronounced it a million times. Unepishtim, or Atrahasis, is how I've talked about it many times. The tale of Atrahasis. He was the king of the humans in Eridu, and Enki was their god. Atrahasis, it's called the Eridu Genesis, or the Ziud Sudra, the Ziu, pronounce that, Zu Sudra. And it was revealed in the plans of the gods, and giving him the exact plans of how to build a boat, and going against the will of all the other gods. And once the flood was over, Atrahasis, or Unepishtim, sends 3 different birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven, to find land. And once on land, Atrahasis offered sacrifices to the gods. A few gods found Atrahasis and the other survivors, and because of mercy they did not kill them, but transformed them to another area to live. Now, obviously, in the Babylonian myths, gods create the flood, and gods save the one faithful and the obedient survivor. But again, more survive the flood. Now, if you look at the Genesis passage, it was supposed to have wiped out everybody that exists in everything. But it says in the Nephilim, in context about the flood, which the Nephilim verses were the preamble to the flood, it said they were on the earth at that time and also afterward. So there were many who survived the flood. So is it possible for the flood to be something that indeed really happened? And as we looked at yesterday and previous days, the answer is absolutely yes. And it was about in that period from 7,000 to 10,000 BCE. You focus in a little tighter, 9 to 7. 8,000 BCE being kind of the median date for this. A shift happened in the axis of the Earth because of the increased ice on the poles, which resulted in melting ice raising the levels of the oceans, flooding the whole world. However, such a flood wouldn't eliminate humanity on the Earth, and a great number of people survived, as we talked about yesterday. So geologists Ryan and Pittman, who we mentioned yesterday, of the Columbia University, suggested that a great flood in the Middle East resulted from rising water levels at the end of the last ice age around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So if we take into account the Sumerian tablets, the flood mentioned would have occurred around 3000 BC, according to the Sumerians, which doesn't coincide with the last polar shift. Or did other floods arise since the last polar shift, as the Egyptian priests said to Plato when he suggested that many floods happened before the end of Atlantis and the Deucalion god or Greek flood myth? So if yes, some say those flood gods would have been responsible for scaling back the floodwaters and restricting them to specific areas. So the Gilgamesh epic, the Sumerian account of the flood, you start to see all these different cultures that basically had the same story during a vast period of time where there was continental shift, where there was polar ice cap melting, climate change. This was natural. It was not because of the industry and the green footprint of man. It was a natural thing. The ice caps build, the axis shifts because of it, they melt. Then they rebuild and the axis will shift again. It's a cycle. The earth keeps going through cycles. And that a great deluge or a series of deluges happened at this time, and it affected every region of humanity. And this is why we have these tales. Now, let's look at another similarity, the Hindu flood legend of Manu and the biblical account of Noah. There are similarities between these. In 1872, the amateur Assyriologist George Smith made a discovery that would shock the world. While studying a particular tablet from the ancient Mesopotamian city of Nineveh, he came across a story that many would have been familiar with. And when Smith succeeded in deciphering the text, he realized that the tablet contained an ancient Mesopotamian myth that paralleled the story of Noah's Ark from the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. And this is what we talked about with the Sumerian texts. Now, today we're aware that flood myths are found not only in Near Eastern societies, but also in many other ancient civilizations throughout the world. There's accounts of a great deluge are seen in ancient Sumerian tablets. The Deucalion in Greek mythology. That sounded almost French. The Deucalion, the Deucalion in Greek mythology. The lore of Quiche in the Mayan peoples of Mesoamerica. The Gunyu myth of China. The stories of La Corte or Orioles in the Ojibwe tribe of North America. And the stories of the Muisca people, to name but a few. And one of the oldest and most interesting accounts originates in Hindu mythology. And while there are discrepancies, it does bear some fascinating similarity to the story of Noah and the Ark. Now, the Hindu flood myth is found in several different sources. The earliest account is said to have been written in the Vedic Satapatha Brahmana. And while later accounts can be found in the Puranas, according to the Bhagavala Purana, and Purana, Purana, not piranha like the fish, and the Matsya Purana, as well as the Mahabharata. I've never said so many Indian words in one sentence. Regardless, all of these accounts, it's easier to write these things down than it is to pronounce them, folks. Trust me. So all of these accounts agree that the main character of the flood story is a man named Manu. Manu Vivasvata. And like Noah, Manu is described as a virtuous individual. He's a righteous man, just like Noah. And in the Satapatha Brahmana, I love to try to get it so I can say these things fast. Satapatha Brahmana, for instance, he has this to say about Manu. There lived in ancient times a holy man called Manu, who by penances and prayers had won the favor of the Lord in heaven. So here's your righteous man who's at the core of the flood story. Manu is said to have 3 sons before the Lord, Ohamra, Sharma, and Yapete, while Noah also had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now, isn't it interesting how similar these names are? Listen to the 3 sons of Manu. You had, I read that as an O, it's a C. C-H-A-R, Karma, Sharma, and Yapeti. And Noah had Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So now Karma and Ham, not so similar in sound. Sharma and Shem sound very similar. Yapeti and Japheth, or Japheth, are very similar. So in the book of Genesis, the cause of mankind's destruction is given as such. It says this, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them." Now this maybe gives us a little insight into the nature of God. Now, bear with me on this, folks. Don't go apeshit about this when I talk about this. I think this shows a God that is man-made, a God that has the attributes of humans, a God who can be so pissed off at something he created and gave free will, and they are sentient life, that he would be willing to destroy them all in the snap of a finger or a catastrophic event because he doesn't like what they've become. That's like saying, I don't like what my son has become, I'm going to kill him and start and make a new one. And so this is what God is doing. This has the earmarks, is this the earmarks of a loving, holy, omnipotent, omnipresent, almighty God? Or are these the actions of somebody who has emotions that are exactly like a human? I'm going to wipe you out because, it repents me. It makes me turn away that I've even created you because you haven't turned out the way I intended you to. So this is what you had with God in the early, and we accept this when we read it in the Bible if you're of Western Christianity, literalist Orthodox Christianity. Yet this sounds less like a God and more like a man. So is this attributes that humans have put on God? Is this who God really is? Is this who the originator is? The creator? It sounds so contradictory to what we learn about God. And of course, as time went on in a biblical sense, all that part, those attributes of God were supposed to be set aside in his Son, in Jesus. And a whole new paradigm of man's relationship with the deity. And it sounds like a lot of mythology, doesn't it? But this is the explanation that was given from a religious point of view. So now, we just heard the Genesis story about God in a Judeo-Christian sense. Now, in the story of Manu in India, however, the destruction of the world is treated as part of the natural order of things, rather than as a divine punishment. Now, it's written in the Matsya Purana that Manu went to the foothills of Mount Malaya and started to perform tapasya, or meditation. Maybe that's pronounced tapasaya. Thousands and thousands of years passed, And such were the powers of Manu's meditation that Brahma appeared before him and said, "I am pleased with your prayers," said Brahma. "Ask for a boon, a favor." "I have only one boon to ask for," replied Manu. "Sooner or later there will be a destruction, a pralaya. The world will no longer exist. Please grant me the boon that it will be I who will save the world, and it begins at the time of the destruction." And Brahma readily granted this boon of Manu. So in the flood myth from the Old Testament, God saves Noah by instructing him to build an ark, a big boat. And it's really, if you get the picture of the big curved prow of a boat and a ship, that's probably not what it was. When you look at the biblical measurements and you get the descriptions, it's really more like a barge. It was just a big box that needed to float and not be necessarily navigable, like with a big rudder and whatever. So he built an ark. And in the Hindu version of the story, it's also thought through divine intervention in the form of the god Vishnu that mankind is preserved from total destruction. And in this story, the god appears to Manu in the form of a little fish whilst he's performing his oblations in a pond. And Manu kept the fish, which grew so quickly that its body occupied the entire ocean in a matter of days. It was then that Vishnu revealed his identity to Manu, told him about the impending destruction and the way to save humanity. There's also a large boat involved in the story of Manu as well. And Vishnu instructed Manu to build a boat, fill it with animals and seeds to repopulate the earth. And he says, "O kind-hearted man," says Vishnu to Manu, "you have care in your heart. Listen now. Soon the world will be submerged by a great flood, and everything will perish. You must build a strong ark and take a long rope on board. You must also take with you the 7 sages who have existed since the beginning of time, and seeds of all things, and pair each of the animals. When you are ready, I will come to you as fish, and I will have horns on my head. Do not forget my words. Without me, you cannot escape the flood." So when the time came, Manu was to tie the boat to the horn of the fish, so that it could be dragged around. Interestingly, this would not be the only time that Vishnu saves mankind from destruction, as he would reappear as avatars over the course of time to preserve life on earth. Now, after the flood, Noah's Ark is said to have rested on the mountains of Urartu, or Ararat. It doesn't specifically say Mount Ararat, it talks about the range of mountains. Similarly, Manu's boat was described as being perched on the top of a range of mountains, the Malaya Mountains in this case. And when the waters had subsided, both Noah and Manu were then said to repopulate the earth, and all human beings could trace their ancestry to either one of those flood survivors. You see the similarities in the story? Does that mean there was a prototype at the beginning? And you see that also with the Gilgamesh epic. So interesting, and I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I want to very quickly, very shortly hit on the cataclysm of Ra, the Egyptian version of this. The concept of cataclysm is very common in almost all mythologies, all religions, all cultures. And it's when the god or the gods decide that humanity is not serving them anymore, and thus they order humanity's destruction. So it makes you feel that all these ancient cultures believed we were all subservient to the gods. So such a concept isn't missing in ancient Egyptian mythology. According to the creation myth, men were created from the tears of the sun god Ra. Ra used to live on earth and ruled his kingdom for many ages. But when he grew old, men ceased worshiping him and rebelled against him. And what followed was a plot to take over his throne. And these actions naturally made Ra furious, and he called for a secret council with the other gods. Ra's father Nun supposed Ra's anger or supported Ra's anger, and he suggested that mankind should be punished. And Nun's daughter, the goddess Hathor, was selected for this mission. And in one night she went out amongst humankind like a lion and began killing men, women, and children in all the places they were hiding, striking and slaying mankind while drinking their blood. This is the god of happiness. This is Hathor. And so the actions of Hathor threatened to completely destroy mankind, something that Ra did not want, as he still wanted to rule them. So in order to stop Hathor from continuing her slaughter, he devised a plan to trick her. At first he puts her up there, and now he's got to trick her. It's like a sitcom. So with the help of his faithful followers, he arranged for large quantities of beer to be mixed with red dye so that it would look like blood. And then they brought 7,000 jars of beer, poured the contents on the fields, flooding the fields where Hathor would return to continue her slaughter. And the next day Hathor returned to eliminate the rest of humanity, saw the large pool of blood. She started drinking from it until she became so hammered that she couldn't remember why she was even there. And when she returned to her father Nun, she slept for many days. And some have hypothesized that Ra was an extraterrestrial. That's for another show. We'll get into that. So there you go, folks. There's, in light, some of the other flood stories. Maybe when we come back next week, we'll hit some of these gods of Egypt. This thing about Ra and Hathor and Nun have me very interested in going into it. By the way, if you want to read a good fictional book that talks about the Egyptian gods, pick up The Red Pyramid by Rick Riordan. It's a kid's book. It's a young adult's. It's a teen adventure. But he goes through in great detail the war between the Egyptian gods. A lot of fun. And we'll hit some of that next week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. We'll see you over the weekend, Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time. Join me right here for It's Sunday on my YouTube channel. See you guys. Have a great weekend.